Hey guys, my name is Laszlo, and in this video we are going to go through some of the most treasured medieval manuscripts that we still have hidden away in prestigious libraries and universities scattered in and around the United Kingdom. We are going to do this to get a bit closer to what I believe is the very beginning of graphic design history in Europe. The art of the Middle Ages, I think, can be a great source of inspiration for anyone who is artistically inclined, but we tend to not talk about these books a lot these days. And I think it's simply due to the fact that, while we all agree that they are objectively beautiful pieces of artworks, the subject matter itself is super intimidating. Lots of Latin words and phrases, old-timey concepts and ideas, most of which have lost their meanings to the creatives and designers of today. So this is the barrier that I mean to break today by guiding you through the evolution of medieval art and design of the British Isles, with the analysis of some of my favorite books that Britain has produced in the Middle Ages. So let's get ready and jump back in time a good 1300 or so years. Are you ready? Okay, for the sake of giving you a clear overall guide, I'm going to take you through 4 manuscripts, 4 books, and set up a chronological order, so you will hopefully see and understand where the act of illustrating these books began and how the styles and techniques evolved as time went on. But before that, I think we need to do a bit of a jargon buster, okay? In the world of art history, these 1,000 or so year old books are called Illuminated Manuscripts. Manuscript is the combination of the Latin words manus, meaning hand, and scriptus, meaning writing, which you probably could have guessed because we still use versions of this word in English, right? The illuminated part comes from the Latin word illuminare, referring to light and the act of lighting something up. This light they are referring to is the act of applying very thin sheets of gold or silver onto the pages themselves to create a reflecting, shiny background effect, a technique that we refer to as gold leafing. Gold leafing was used in medieval art quite a lot in order to symbolize divine light. Most of these books at the time were decorated in this way, with real precious metals, but we tend to refer to all sorts of books as illuminated manuscripts from this time, just for the sake of simplicity. The act of illumination is basically what we would call illustration today, and the artists are not illustrators but illuminators. Simple enough, yeah? Illuminated manuscripts tend to refer to Western European Christianity-themed books predominantly, but that is not to say that there aren't other types of manuscripts out there. You can find similar books beyond Old Albion, beyond Christianity, and way beyond Europe, in fact. For this video I have decided to focus on medieval Britain, because I think the easiest way to get you guys familiarized with this subject matter and demonstrate how the art and design changed and evolved as time went on, it's probably the best to showcase that if we focus on a fixed location. Okay? Now, let's get to the good stuff. Firstly, let's take a look at the Book of Kells. You can't really talk about medieval manuscripts without mentioning this one. The Book of Kells is a gospel book from the 9th century, and it's probably the most famous manuscript that the British Isles have ever produced. Highly regarded as the epitome of the Insular illumination style, with its remarkable interlacing decor elements resembling and in fact originating from Celtic folk art, the type of design work that came from the metal work of the Celts. Weaponry, jewels, helmets and whatnot. In the Book of Kells, every page, every little illumination is so masterfully crafted. Legend says it that the people who have seen it at the time regarded it to be a work of angels rather than of mortal men. The intricate decoration with its obvious pagan influences, which you can see everywhere in this book, are most notable, in my opinion, is what they call the carpet page. A page like this, which is essentially a non-figurative, complex pattern but perfectly symmetrical composition with little to no writing, resembling a carpet. This is a very common element of gospel books, marking the beginning of a chapter. Carpet pages are not exclusive to gospel books though. They can be found marking the beginning of a book or important sections within a book, not just in Christian literature, but also in Hebrew and Islamic manuscripts as well. In fact, there are theories out there that the whole idea of carpet pages and making illustrations, illumination work that resembling carpets probably came from the East, where carpets were always all the rage and have a very strong symbolic meaning in terms of religion. Now, gospel books, if you're not familiar, are manuscripts containing the first 4 books of the Christian New Testament. These books are what we call the 4 Gospels, the 4 written versions of the words, deeds and life of Jesus according to 4 of his closest disciples: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. These disciples, who would later become saints of the Christian faith, have very specific symbols in manuscripts, which we can observe in the Book of Kells. St Matthew, the author of the first Gospel's symbol is a winged man resembling an angel, representing Christ's human nature. St Mark's symbol is a winged lion, a figure of royalty, signifying that Christ is king. St Luke, the patron saint of painters, is always shown as a winged ox, a common figure of sacrifice. And St John's symbol is an eagle, representing vision and foresight. You can oftentimes find these totem-like symbols on the corners of illuminated compositions, usually surrounding an important saint, oftentimes Jesus himself. The four of them always being by the side of God, if you will. Okay, for our second manuscript we need to jump forward a good 100 or so years to get to the Winchester Benedictional, also known as the Benedictional of St Aethelwold. Aethelwold was a highly regarded bishop of Winchester in the late 900s, and while it is very unlikely that he himself illustrated, or shall we say illuminated, this manuscript, we know for sure that he was certainly a great scholar and a great patron of the arts at the time. Now, a benedictional is essentially a book of blessings that is being pronounced by a bishop during the liturgical year. And this one, which is the product of the Winchester School of Manuscript Illumination, is one of the most impressive one of its kind. By this time, the monks who were working on manuscript illumination were ordered to break away from the classic Celtic-centric styles from the previous century, with all its infinite knots and interlacing patterns, and look for artistic inspiration outside of the kingdom. Why, you might wonder? Well, it's actually have a lot to do with the Vikings. Vikings came and ravaged through the British Isles by this point in history. And as you might know, Viking art closely resembled these Celtic motifs. And because of that, the religious leadership has deemed this the barbaric, the primitive way of decorating, as the church wanted nothing to do with the Vikings and, you know, their rather unchristian ways. And so, English book illumination in the 900s started to closely resemble the artworks of the neighboring kingdoms of Europe, specifically the art of the Carolingian Empire, England's closest neighboring kingdom on the old continent. The signature bold picture frame resembling illuminated margins were so unique and radical at the time that it kind of created its own style, that later scriptors all around England tried to emulate, and now we refer to this as the Winchester style of decorating. The floral decorational elements are supposed to be acanthus leaves, the plant that is also an essential element of the signature Corinthian column heads of ancient Greece. Illuminators all over Europe were clearly aiming to reference the great empires of antiquity, ancient Greece and Rome in particular, when they were trying to define their art styles. Now we know that in the dawn of book illumination, every stage of creating a manuscript were done by the same person, a monk who would prepare the pages, do the scribing, and the illumination work. But as time went on, people started to have certain jobs. They started to specialize within one area in certain stages of the bookmaking process. There is written evidence that the Winchester Benedictional was scribed by a monk named Godman, but historians can't say for sure if he did the artwork for the book as well. Whether the book is his work only or not, it is clear that great amounts of planning went into the image making process here. Here for the first time in the illuminating process, we are starting to see how deliberate the artists were with their spatial planning on the page. As you can see, there are overlaps between the foreground and the background on these pieces. The design elements have been carefully stacked on top of each other to create the essence of three-dimensional compositions. Thanks to Aethelwold's close relationship with the royal family of Britain, Winchester became one of the two main book producers in England at the time, which led the artists of the Winchester scriptorium to really spend time and define this art style. And we know that for sure because some of these mark makings that they have pioneered have been carried over hundreds of years as we moved forwards in time. Speaking of which, let's time jump again. Next on our reading list is the Winchester Bible. Now, if you have been paying attention to the time frames that I'm using here, the recurring pattern is each time the illuminators created and defined a new artistic style, it took roughly about 100 or so years, a century, to establish that. And that's exactly what happened here to get to a new style. Now we are in the 12th century, and this Bible has been created in what we call the Romanesque style. This is an important point, in manuscript illumination and its history for many reasons. Firstly, while these monks who have been scribing and illuminating, they have always spent quite a lot of their lives traveling around the known world, getting inspired, exchanging and copying artistic styles and ideas, concepts. Art historians agree that the Romanesque was the first truly international art style in this field that all kingdoms in Europe were trying to participate in, from the Mediterranean to all the way up to Scandinavia. The term Romanesque literally means in the style of the Romans, so the idea was clearly to build on this carolingian concept of getting inspired by antiquity, but times that by like 100. Everything here is bigger, bolder and much more ambitious than before. In a way, it became a competition, I believe, of who can make the best artwork, which monastery or which kingdom has the ability to create the most prestigious, the most impressive and the most expensive piece of work. The Winchester Bible is a testament to this, as this was a huge undertaking. We know for sure from the notes left behind that at least 6 different artists have worked on it at the time. They collaborated on this physically quite big, not to mention expensive manuscript project. We should also state that up until this point, having a Bible in the form that we are familiar with today was quite uncommon. The idea of having all biblical text, which is essentially a series of different books in one big book, was quite a new concept that the Catholic Church was just adopting at the time. From the artistic point of view, there is one key element that we need to mention here. The one thing that clearly gained prominence in Romanesque art was the idea of using narrative. The idea of using art not just to decorate with the imagery, but to actually tell and carry a story with nothing but pictures became a new norm. Like, actual illustration. The Winchester Bible's ambition was to create a heavily illustrated initial for each of the Bible's books, all of which would tell a story somewhat relating to the text it's introducing. If you look at the Morgan leaf, for example, a famous page which have been taken out of the Winchester Bible, we see a series of illuminations telling you the life and times of King David. The 3 sets of illustrations kind of work like comic book panels, each row showing you a before and an after stage within a story. On the top, for example, we see David fighting Goliath on the left, and then on the right we see, well, what we see is the aftermath of the fight. On the bottom of the page we see Absalom, David's son, being killed, and on the right David's been informed of this death and starts grieving. The Winchester Bible was such an ambitious and costly project that it actually never got completely finished. All the text, the display script, and the base sketchwork for the additional missing illuminations are there, but some of the actual final renders, the painting work, never got finished. Which is a bittersweet fact, because this led to a lack of use of this book. And that is the only reason why we still have this book in a pretty well preserved condition. So yeah. You win some, you lose some, I guess. Okay, time jump. Let's talk about the Gothic era and Queen Mary Psalter. Now, the Gothic era is the time when the craft of manuscript illumination gets out of the Christian monasteries. The church would still produce manuscripts, of course, but besides them, specialized bookmaking workshops also started to pop up all over Europe. And with that, not just the artists, but the owners and the patrons of these books became a bit more varied. These bookmaking workshops were the precursors of what we would call publishing houses today, which is just one of the many examples how the infrastructure started to develop quite massively during this time. In previous times in history, the reality was that only royal or religious leaders could possess books like this, which is due to this huge disparity between the rich and the poor that really defined the Dark Ages in Britain. But then the world started to change a little bit. By the 14th century, you didn't have to be born into wealth in order to have some options in life. You could make your own money if you were a successful tradesman, a master craftsman. You could have attended one of the newly opened universities. A lot of development happened during this time, which effectively have created a whole new societal class. The educated, literate people who were living in the bigger cities. That is not to say that book ownership has gotten fully democratized. No, not just yet. Make no mistake, you still had to be quite rich, quite wealthy to afford a book.
Isn't being a man enough?
And for proof of that, we can observe how history preserved Gothic manuscripts still owned by royals first and foremost. Hence my example of Queen Mary Psalter. Now Queen Mary Tudor was the daughter of Henry VIII, who the Psalter got its name after, although we do know that the manuscript was not originally made for her. In fact, it was produced nearly 200 years before Mary's birth. A Psalter is essentially a little handbook of Christianity. These would contain things like Bible verses, liturgical calendars, lists of saints' names and their holidays, the structure of the Christian Mass, all sorts of info which a devoted Christian might like to have at hand in a small, pocket-sized format. In terms of art and design, you probably don't even need me to tell you how ambitious and incredible the Gothic era was. I for one have been a huge fan of Gothic architecture way before I even understood what any of this means. Ever since I've seen Disney's rendition of the Notre Dame as a young kid, with its ornate decoration and labyrinth-like, larger-than-life design. It really just fascinated me back in 1996 when this movie came out. So I could just talk about this movie for a whole other video's length, but I'm not gonna, don't worry. I'm only bringing this up because once you get yourself into analyzing Gothic manuscripts, you really will find that this was a style that transcended mediums. Art, architecture, textiles, everything was relating to everything. You can see how this Psalter, in many ways, is aiming to evoke the look and feel of large stained glass church windows, for example. I believe that this was the point where manuscript illumination has reached its absolute peak. All learnings from previous times have been carried forward. And this example of a book, which is quite uniquely the work of one singular artist, I thought was a good opportunity to really break everything down that we have learned so far. So I thought I would single out one page in this book in order to show you all the design elements that come together in order to actually build up the page layout. Firstly, on the page, or as the professionals refer to manuscript pages, on the leaf, we see the main illustrated scene, a miniature of Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, with the help of an angel on his right. We then see an initial design for the capital letter E, in which we see King David from the Old Testament playing the bells. Now, according to the Old Testament, David was playing the bells, and led other musicians too during the installation of the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. The body copy is made up of not only plain text, but you can also observe this decorated capital letter S, which I'd argue could be referred to as display script, something the artist would use to mark a beginning of an important chapter or sentence. I say I could argue because technically this is just another initial letter, and the term display script tends to refer to a whole word, a phrase, sometimes a whole sentence, but in this context I think it's worth mentioning. Now, in case this wasn't enough art for one page, we also have what they call a bas de page scene of a lion and a unicorn. Bas de page is French for bottom of the page, which is where you would find frameless, sometimes quirky artworks, which oftentimes have little to nothing to do with the overall book itself. The lion and the unicorn are common English and Scottish heraldic symbols, something which I have made a whole other video on you can watch after this one if you are interested. Now, if you have been looking around for other videos on this topic, you probably have seen that there are whole dedicated videos on these aforementioned funny little grotesque illustration works everyone always picks up on when we talk about medieval art. Now, these weird little bas de page paintings are called Drolleries, coming from another French word, drollerie, meaning a joke. And while they are super amusing and all, I don't think there's much point trying to overanalyze these. These miniatures are always at the margins of the page, and it is common knowledge that more often than not they have absolutely nothing to do with the subject matter of the book they were drawn in. These are little signs of mark making, in which the artists seemingly have no restrictions at all. Seemingly everything was free game, and so I think it is fair to call them the sketchbooks of the Middle Ages. This is not the time and place to get into way too much details on this, but you can imagine how even the first step of making books in this old-fashioned way, making the pages themselves, was an incredibly manual labor-intensive process, really hard work. So I think that the artists just wanted to make sure that they are using every single page to its fullest potential. Now, if you're a very factual, scientifically inclined, get-to-the-point type person, you probably would be interested to know that these paintings have been known to have some navigational purpose within books before the idea of page numbers became a thing. Because, you know, you might not remember what was the first sentence of the page that you're looking for in your book. But if you remember that the given page had some jousting rabbits riding on a human-headed snail, well, I think you will remember that. Not to mention, these little caricatures have the ability to amuse the people who were illiterate and they couldn't actually read the text that they are looking at. Now if you're anything like me, more of a humanities type person, and a bit more, go with the flowing fairies type, then you know that sketchbook work has never meant to be taken seriously. This is the place where an artist gets to just experiment, test out ideas, and let the imagination just roam wild. Sometimes people draw silly things because, well, they are just fun to draw. History have us and the people of the Middle Ages so far removed from each other that I think it's very easy to forget that at the end of the day, those guys, they were just people, just like you and me. Some of these artists and scribes, they probably had a great sense of humor. And I would imagine medieval people liked a good laugh, just like you and I would, or pull pranks on each other for no reason at all. I imagine there are a lot of in-jokes, visual gags on these pages, which we can't make much sense of anymore without the historical context. I think that's what the Monty Python guys were trying to say with their work as well. I'd like to think that artists of the Middle Ages would always try to outdo each other and one-up the rival manuscript producer in the next town with some of these caricatures, to kind of see how much they can get away with. And I also think that some of these works should be considered as illustration portfolio pieces of the time. Not very different to what we artists would do today, trying to create work that, really stands out. Now, the Gothic time period was the last great notable era of manuscript illumination in the traditional sense, and so our evolutionary timeline stops here. Now this has all to do with one Johann Gutenberg, a German goldsmith who has found a way to build a mechanism based around movable, individually cast letters, which could be arranged and rearranged to form any written word, and thus quickly replicate any piece of written information. This invention, of course, was the printing press, which without a doubt revolutionized the bookmaking process in Western Europe, and of course changed the old continent as we know it forever. But that, I believe, is a story for another time. Now how's that for graphic design history? Guys, feel free to let me know what you think about all these incredible books that we just went through. I sincerely hope that you find all this stuff inspiring, and if you did, well, make sure to come back to our channel for more of this kind of thing. Cool? Cool. Okay, I was Laszlo from Dantier and Balog, and I'll see you next time. Cheerio!